Questions? None yet. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike to get started.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to this webinar. I never thought 31 years later I'd be doing a Zoom type training webinar, so it's pretty cool. So I'm evolving. I'd like to first introduce one of my co-instructors in my 8-hour homeless liaison officer course that I present through POST and CPOA. Sandra Sagert, she's our community preservation manager. She wears a lot of hats at the city of Anaheim, but she's also well versed in the high level ongoing issues that are involving the homeless population. So I'm gonna kick it off with Sandra.
Thanks, Mike. First, I want to thank Sean and Carol for putting this together. I think it's an important subject, not only with our entire state, but the nation as a whole. But just to give you some feedback and some national data, just to kind of get an idea of why it's so bad here. And then hopefully have an understanding that, you know, homelessness is never going to be solved with enforcement alone. I think the problem is the only people up 24/7 are homeless and police, which creates a problem for the police environment. And at the same time, outreach alone is not going to work either. We've seen excerpts from Seattle is Dying and other agencies where they just try and do a lot of outreach. So what our big takeaway today is that it's going to be a balance of outreach and enforcement, and sometimes creative enforcement. And so that's where I've helped in certain areas, and we'll go over that today. But the key is that you need to collaborate not only with nonprofits and other outreach service providers, but also county and other agencies, and even in your own departments in your city. For national data, there's over 500,000 people nationwide that are homeless on the street. That's unsheltered. So the last data in 2019 was 552,000. Out of that number, 25% is in California. So when you want to know why it's so bad in California, it's because we have a quarter of the entire nation's population of homeless unsheltered in our state. We go over some numbers in our counties. I know LA County is like 60,000. Orange County is only 6,800. But we're all struggling with the same dilemma. And in Anaheim, even though, you know, we may not consider ourselves experts in the entire field, we have reduced our unsheltered population over the years. In 2016, we had close to 800 on our streets. And as of 2019, we're down to about 694 and a little bit less than that recently. One of the key things you do have to do is obviously know your population. So we do census counts, which I think is important. So you know your type of population, not only to help yourself out in the field, but also for your housing authorities and other agencies that are trying to build housing. So we're building specific housing based on our population. We have an aging population of homeless. We're building a senior housing. We have an increase in our youth, at-risk youth, so we're building that type of housing. So knowing your population is crucial. The coordinated services we have are anywhere from our psychiatric emergency response team that Mike will touch on, our HOT team, which is our homeless outreach team, but also all of our departments in the city. I can tell you the most aggressive department that we have is our librarians. They're very good at documenting. They're very good at protecting their space, but also a lot of homeless individuals go in there. So they're also a good collaborator when you're needing help as far as like rules of being in public facilities. So why are we here? A lot of times we get complaints from our constituents and residents that homeless people have more freedom than we do to do whatever they want. And so part of it is there are laws on the land that do protect some of our homeless population. And so it's important to have those at your ready. And I know Sean's going to be posting some of those resource links for you. The biggest thing that will get you into trouble is related to beds and property. Making sure you have available beds for the homeless population, but also that you're handling their property. Those are the two bigaboos. Those are the ones that get everybody into trouble. So the law on the land, obviously, if you haven't heard, is Martin versus Boise, Idaho. Real quick, there is some gentleman that was sleeping on their sidewalk in Boise. They cited him. He challenged it, and actually the homeless individual won. It did go to Ninth Circuit court decision, and it is currently the law on the land. Now that is in California and some other states, but that Ninth Circuit was appealed to the Supreme Court. nationwide, and the Supreme Court did not hear it. They did not want to hear it. So basically, it's the law of land, but it's only related to public property and only related to those ordinances on your books related to sleeping purposes. So anti-camping ordinances, loitering or blocking public thoroughfares, storage of property, and then also sometimes they'll roll in like being in the facilities after dark, so being in your parks after closing. Everything else is on the table. So 11-550, urinating and drinking in public, those types of things are all still free to enforce. It's only if you're going to enforce anything related to sleeping. And what it also talks about is that you have an appropriate and available bed. So when we had our first shelter from the county put in Anaheim, they have a lot of bunk beds, almost prison style when you go in there. So if you have an available bed on the top bunk, but you're dealing with somebody in a wheelchair, not considered appropriate. So that's why it's important to know your population so you know how to deal with it. Another important aspect is emergency preparedness. We did start, and I'm the homeless liaison for our emergency operations center, and I think it's important to have somebody. We created that position in our EOC, and it's important to look at that. You could have disasters from earthquakes or other things where you know where homeless populations are, and it's important to at least have the resources to be able to address it. So it's important to have that, especially during this pandemic. The governor did issue an order, N32-20, and again, Sean's going to have those resources for you. And in that governor's order, it specifically talks about having isolation rooms, because we can all self-quarantine in our own home, but they don't have one. So enough resources to have isolation rooms or trailers. So the state of California gave the top cities available brand new trailers, 2020 Jayco RV style camper trailers, as well as some state funding. So we, as Anaheim, got $1.385 million. And so in that governor's order was to create isolation room capacity, but also additional shelter capacity. The other thing they talked about is in the CDC guidelines, which is also a resource that you'll see. And it talks about you cannot clear encampments during this pandemic unless you have all the right resources. You can't just take all these people off the street right now during the pandemic and shove them into a shelter. They could spread the disease if they are infected. So that's where the isolation rooms, you see a lot of that Project Room Key. There's 15,000 hotel rooms, but only, I think, 1,800 people in them. So again, that goes back to that resistive population and not wanting to get off the street. But in our case, in Boise versus Martin, you have to have them available in order to do what we can do out on the street. The other lawsuit we were involved in was with property, about people. A lot of our agencies were just picking up property and throwing it away. This is their whole world belongings that they have, everything they own. And so what we ended up creating through our lawsuit with that was procedures in place to mark property, book it, release it, and dispose of the stuff after a certain period of time. So there's state law in the books that you have to hold on to property for 90 days before you can dispose of it. However, in the California Civil Code, there's also specific code sections on disposing of stuff that is hazardous, soiled. So we created a policy and procedure. And again, this was blessed by the ACLU, our lawyers, all in our settlement, where we actually will mark property for 24 hours, if it's open and available for 24 hours, like a sidewalk. But if a park closes at 10:30, like many of ours do, if we have abandoned property and stuff in there, we'll mark it till the end of that closure of that facility, and then we can take it legally. And we have a little marking tag that we utilize, and that's huge because that makes them uncomfortable. If you start taking their possessions, it makes it very uncomfortable for them. On top of when we take their possessions, about 80% of it gets thrown away because a lot of it's soiled, has feces on it, urine, is wet. And so we document heavily and photograph all that when we do that and dispose of it. It is very beneficial, and it's a huge deterrent. So these marking tags that we utilize, our librarians use them around their facilities, park maintenance workers. And so these homeless population have gotten used to seeing these property tags. And as soon as they start seeing it, they know the property is going to get taken. So they'll move on. In our jurisdiction, code enforcement actually books property for the police department. Let me say that again. Code enforcement will actually book the property for our police department. So when we go out to these encampments, the police department focuses on the body and we take the property. and we go through it all. We dispose of it. We book it for them. We also release it for them and dispose for them. It's a huge asset to team up to where the police can focus on the actual body. We focus on the property, and then our public works comes in and actually dispose of any trash. So those are a huge component that we do. In our settlement with the riverbed, for those of you might have remembered the big riverbed stretch by Angel Stadium, we were included in that lawsuit because there was a small sliver of our property that cut into the stadium, and then we were rolled in, even though the riverbed was controlled by the county. During that, Judge Carter came up with an idea to clear it out, but we needed to have appropriate and available beds. There was an argument by the plaintiffs saying that 80% of the people, which we had about 1,000 people, wanted to go into shelter. We argued probably less than half do. So just like in divorce court, we said 40%, they said 80%. He went right down the middle and picked 60%. So our settlement, we have to have 60% of our population, homeless population, beds available. So right now, and that was from the point in time count in 2017. So right now we have 325 beds. We have less than 300 people in there right now, and we're adding an additional 100 beds just from the stuff we've been seeing in our population. But I can tell you with our bed count and what we're seeing, we're closer to that 40% than what the plaintiffs were saying, or even the judge. If you've seen recently, Judge Carter is in LA, and he just ordered the city of LA to clear out 7,000 homeless people under the freeways, which is going to be a huge endeavor. Orange County only has 6,800 unsheltered, so they're going to be doing more than what's in the entire Orange County in a matter of a few days in LA City. So we'll be watching that as well. I'll probably, since it's a short session here, I'll hand it back over to Sergeant Lozeau to talk about those day-to-day operations and encampment clearings. But I can tell you, like Caltrans has a directive not to clear out encampments based on these governor orders and guidelines, but that specifically says they will partner with you if you have available beds for them. So they were not aware that Anaheim does have their own shelter and beds. So now they are seeking to get approval at the state level to come help us clear out some of those Caltrans properties where we have a few encampments, because our public properties are actually pretty clean. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. So as we can see, this topic keeps getting more and more complicated as it evolves, but we try to stay abreast and keep moving forward with this. I want to talk about SB Law 1152. I call it the Homeless Hospital Law. And basically, before they discharge a homeless person from a hospital, they have to do 5 things for that particular homeless person. They got to provide clothing, food, medicine for up to 30 days if it's appropriate, and provide or locate a shelter bed and provide transportation. And that law was created to avoid the old adage of the hospitals dumping their patients onto the streets without providing these items here, and then leaving law enforcement and fire to deal with it later on. The encouraging thing, as you heard, Sandra, is our numbers are going down in Anaheim. So that proves that our model that we're doing in Anaheim is working. It's taken us several years to see a positive downward trend, but we know it's working. So going back to what has caused this problem, the increased homeless problem in California, a lot of you know the trifecta laws, the trifecta of laws, the AB 109, Prop 47 and 57. Basically, those laws indicate that we can't arrest ourselves out of this problem. We're going to have to collaborate with nonprofit that's going to push law enforcement into being a little bit more on the social worker side, because we cannot arrest ourselves out of this problem. In Anaheim, we tried a few years ago when I created our homeless outreach team and our psychiatric emergency response teams. And I thought it was smart back then. I said, you know what, I'm going to try and lower calls to service as a mission and an objective. So in 2007, we had about 3,300 calls, and in 2018, it ballooned up to 20,000. So then I said, you know what, I'm failing. I got to restructure my mission. And I said, well, how about I focus on collaboration and outreach and getting these folks into shelters? And I think over a long period of time, we're going to get these folks off the street. And thank God that's exactly what happened in Anaheim, is our numbers went down and we've been getting folks off the street. And the folks that we do get off the street, there's a 90% retention rate. And we don't count relocating people to the National Guard armories at night as a relocation. What we count as a relocation is a permanent shelter bed. They transition into temporary housing with supportive management, case management, and eventually, hopefully, they go into long-term permanent housing with supportive case management. So boots on the ground stuff, just remember, you're not going to rest yourselves out of this problem. So try to provide a lot of outreach, document your outreach, and also document your enforcement. Your enforcement is going to be as a last resort. When you got a non-compliant homeless individuals causing you calls to service and criminal complaints, you do all the outreach you can. You may have to do a dozen outreach contacts, and you may get lucky and convince that person to get off the streets. But when that outreach fails, then eventually you're going to have to resort to enforcement to get that person's attention. And what we're trying to do here with the outreach and enforcement is we're trying to make it uncomfortable for these folks to be on the street. Eventually, they're either going to accept that resource, that shelter bed, and get off the streets, or they're going to move out of the area and go some other jurisdiction where they don't have this program in place. So either way, you know, for us, it works, but our main goal is trying to get these folks into shelter beds. And there they have drug rehab, they have mental health resources that's provided to them, case managers. It works out really well, at least in our shelters in Anaheim. For boots on the ground, prioritize your complaints. Before you go in service, make sure you know your bed count at your local shelters. It's important because, like Sandra said, if you're going to force your camping ordinances or anything to do with sleeping, then you're going to have to show that you had available beds available before you did that enforcement, or else you may get sued and you will lose based on Martin or the Boise, Idaho case. And documentation is the key. Just put that in your police report as you went in service and you went to enforce your camping ordinance. You knew there was 10 male beds, 10 female beds, 5 ADA compliant beds, pets were available, etc. It sounds kind of corny, but it's needed because if somebody files a complaint later on, you can backtrack and show your report and go, it's all documented, airtight, and you're good to go. Make sure your operational plans, you plan accordingly. So if you're going to take down an encampment, make sure you bring enough resources. So if you have about 20 homeless individuals in an encampment, don't just bring 2 officers. You know, bring 20 officers. You're going to have to plan for it. You may have to do a regionalized effort, call your local partner agencies to supply, partner up with a couple officers from each agency and do a little task force out of it. Bring your mental health partners, outreach workers, have shelter transportation in case one of these homeless folks wants to go to their shelter. Have medical resources available in case there's a medical situation that develops. You may have to have a jail van as the last resort to arrest people, but the key to this thing is just plan appropriately and you'll be successful in dealing with these large encampments. Look at step-dead solutions, crime prevention through environmental designs. I always teach the officers that take a hard look at your environment. If there's something you can change with that environment to make it less attractive for these folks to hang out there and cause you calls to service, then it's time to engage either the private property owner or the city or the county that owns the property and try and make some step-dead changes to that property. It could be extra lighting, cutting down bushes, eliminating dirt berms, fencing, anything that's going to make it less attractive for the folks to be there. Again, I talked about collaboration. You know, I'm cramming a lot of stuff here. I apologize. We only have 30 minutes, so I'm trying to run through this. Normally it's an 8-hour course. So there's a lot of homeless that are dying every year. So for Orange County, for example, we have about 200 homeless deaths per year. And they did stats on that, and about 50% of those deaths were drug related. They overdosed. And I'll bet you it's a little bit higher than that because the other half, they said they died of other illnesses, but I'll bet you some of it was caused from the drug usage. So it's imperative that you're able to partner up with some nonprofit partners that deal with drug rehabilitation centers, halfway houses, etc., because that's going to help you get some of these heavily narcotics addicted people off the street. Use good officer safety, contact and cover, avoid contamination skin to skin. A lot of these folks have MRSA. We've had officers contract MRSA scabies, you name it. So we always teach good officer safety. One officer do the talking and the other officers are eyes and ears, heads on a swivel, and bring the appropriate amount of officers to be able to deal with a certain situation you're dealing with, the number of homeless that you're dealing with. Don't let your guard down. A lot of these folks, not a lot, but there are some folks that are hardcore parolees that have now infiltrated this homeless population. I used to say years ago that there wasn't a criminal stigma attached to this homeless population. Well, now due to the trifecta of laws that I mentioned earlier with AB 109, Prop 4757, now there is a lot of hardcore gangsters and parolees that now are infiltrating our homeless population, and they're putting these folks to work. They're doing human trafficking, they're making them sell dope, and they're trying to make a buck and trying to prey on this homeless population. So don't let your guard down out there. Make sure you got your heads on a swivel. We've had in LA County, I know for a fact, there was a railroad police officer that he went to take down a tent on the side of the railroad track, and it was booby trapped. The tent went up in flames. It was like a propane tank that was rigged somehow to explode when they moved around this tent. So, I know back in my day when I was working on the job with the homeless outreach team, we've encountered every type of weapon: rifles, handguns, machetes, knives. Every homeless guy's got a knife out there. They use it for self-protection, obviously. So do not let your guard down. It's really important that you maintain excellent documentation of all of your outreach contacts and your enforcement contacts. Because if you got the old, viral video, a cell phone video of your officers taking down a homeless individual that's being arrested, and all of a sudden he goes fisticuffs a little bit, and somebody's cell phone taping that, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to try and criminalize your officers and media. They're going to say, look, they're picking on this poor homeless. But in reality, when you can backtrack, you can say, hey, look, we've done 20 contacts with this homeless person. We've provided outreach 15 times. He's declined resources every time. Here's the documented efforts that we've done. We're not nonprofits. Yes, the last 5 times were enforcement efforts. And then this 20th time that we contacted him, he became violent. And yes, we had to use force to take him down. So now if you get sued, and politically, you're going to be able to protect yourselves because now you have this data to back this up, why this person was, resistive to accepting resources and is being problematic. So most of you know that, but this is good to go over that. Like Sandra said, when dealing with homeless property, make sure if you're going to discard some piece of property subsequent to an arrest, or if you're going to transport somebody to a shelter, but there's an excess property, make sure on body-worn camera, you get the homeless person to tell you, yeah, I don't want that stuff. It's trash. You can throw it away. Photograph, document that in your report, because I guarantee you they're going to come back 3 or 4 months later potentially and say, oh, look, I had $1,000 in there. I really didn't want you guys to throw it away. Well, now you have them on tape saying, yeah, throw it away 3 months ago. You're protected. So it sounds kind of corny, but this homeless property, it's one of, Sandra probably can attest, it's one of our most problematic issues. They're always accusing us of, throwing away some of their valuable property that we don't think is property, but it is. Our property and procedure laws for the PD, which is, a administrative document that says that we're not going to allow homeless or hazardous property to be booked in our facility because it can contaminate our facility. So we actually have that paragraph in there. And if somebody needs that, you guys can contact us and we'll send you that verbiage, because we use that hazardous paragraph to our advantage. When we see something that's smelly, wet, there's bugs crawling on it, there's feces, there's urine, we're not required to book that property. It's hazardous and we throw it away, but we document why it was hazardous, and it covers ourselves. So we're coming up to the 30-minute mark here. So in closing, I want to say that working with the homeless population is very rewarding. You end up saving lives, but unfortunately you can't save them all. And there's been a lot of folks that I've seen die on the streets that I tried to save, and you can't save them all. It's tedious but rewarding work. I have a lot of homeless today that are in shelters. They're healthy now. They used to create us a lot of calls to service, and now they're good spots. So it's kind of cool for me to see that end result, but sometimes it takes a lot of painstaking work to get to that point. So stay the course. It's going to take a long time to see positive results in working this homeless problem. Thank you.
So I put 2 links in the chat box for everyone. Hopefully you saw. One was the governor's executive order on this topic, and the other was CDC guidelines, COVID-19 guidelines on homeless shelters and unsheltered homeless populations. So please use those as a resource. If you'd like to ask a question or share something that's happening in your jurisdiction, I know I have a question, but I want to open it up to everyone first. Go ahead and unmute yourself, or put it in the chat button. It's probably quicker to just unmute yourself, and feel free to ask a question to either one of our facilitators today. So I'll start to see if there are any questions out there from the audience.
Sandra, I have a question. I'd like to see a copy of that tag that you were talking about. Is that something maybe you could send to Sean and I could take a look at? And then I had a thought while you were explaining that, and I'm wondering if there's a barcode or some other RFID type tracking device, so that if you're tagging property, you could, the librarian concept got me thinking about that a little bit. If there's a way to quick scan stuff to a case number or something like that, while your code enforcement guy or your police officer, whatever, is collecting a bunch of property?
That's a great question. I can definitely send over a property tag, and then also our link to our homeless webpage. I think that's important to see everything we do more globally. We do in code enforcement have a GIS system set up where if a librarian takes a picture of a property that's been tagged, they'll email it to us, and we actually have it pinpointed on GIS, and then our officers out in the field have the mobile app, and they're able to then follow up, and it'll know when those hours are up. And so if something's marked for 24 hours, they'll know the next day to go by there. And that's huge because we upload all our photos through our mobile device and all of the documentation. So we've had the last few claims that we've had put in for their father's urn, ashes were thrown away, I had a diamond necklace, all those types of things. We were able to substantiate through our documentation and all our photographs and stuff. So that was huge, and we'd be happy to share that electronic version. We do it not only for property, but for a lot of different stuff. Public Works keeps track. We keep track of a lot of our costs, and that was important when we made an investment in our shelters for $25 million with 3 shelters that were built in 79 days. We were able to show the city, we were already spending $18 million a year citywide on librarians and utility workers and public works dealing with homelessness.
Perfect, thanks.
Any other questions or thoughts from the audience? So I'll ask a question then. A few years ago, I went on a ride along with my HOT team here from El Dorado County, the Sheriff's Department, and we came up to some encampments, and they were said, oh, I'm going to come back this afternoon. I'm going to drive you to your appointment, your court appointment, or whatever it is. Stay clean until then. Facilitated their kind of recovery. At the same time, you see, and I just saw from the in San Francisco, that they're providing alcohol and tobacco and even marijuana on a limited basis to avoid kind of the withdrawals and things, but they're actually kind of, facilitating that lifestyle, so to speak. You mentioned the kind of trifecta of legislation that I'm well familiar with because I lobbied against all of it. But you're starting to see, at least from the legislator and the Capitol, they're trying to push these, speaking of San Francisco, you're trying to push these shooting galleries that you can go and just shoot up, and we'll give you all the, syringes and everything you need. And then, you're not liable for any drug crimes. They're trying to do that kind of stuff. Have you had any response to that lately? You have a couple of hotels in Anaheim. So I don't know if that's been something, at least of late during this crisis, or just kind of how did you deal with things like that if that happened, where it was kind of like, physicians or community members kind of, not really helping you out?
So you want to answer that, Sandra, or you want to do that?
Either one, if you had
Okay. So I think the key is to, when you have somebody, some activists and the community members that are active that are kind of being counterproductive, so to speak, and they're kind of giving you a hard time, and they're kind of like, bad talking your efforts. The key to that is to engage those folks in community meetings. And I firmly believe that the more, neighborhood meetings that you can have, engaging the public and informing them of your current ongoing efforts. In our experience, it's reduced those activists' ways of causing us problems, because the more meetings you have, the more information you put out, it's going to reduce those problems with those folks. Sandra, you can add to that if you want, obviously.
Yeah, when we did our community meetings, we did more of, instead of having meetings where they can all come and speak because they'll bash you for a very long time, we actually did more of an open house where we had different stations of topics. So the police chief was at his for safety. I was over at the laws of the land explaining why we have to do these things. But I think the important thing is by having shelters and those beds available, there's at least a place for them to go. Right now we have over 300 people in our shelters that would otherwise be in our streets and in front of our businesses. So we try to encourage that. And I think because of our efforts, we had Angels baseball, we had Disney, we had the Ducks all step up and pitch in finances to help with these shelters. And I think that's encouraging. Our Chamber of Commerce came to the table as well, because I think it was in Phoenix or somewhere in Arizona, there was it was in Denver, Colorado, where they were looking to allow homeless to sleep wherever in the downtown area, and it was on a ballot measure, and the business community fought heavily against it, and they actually won. Because I think they're starting to see that they're getting a little fed up with, okay, how far are we going to take this? We don't mind helping to provide resources, but there still needs to be an accountability. And that's where you start to see that fight against, okay, we want to help them, but we also need to have that accountability as well. And so that's where we try and balance it. And if you look at our web page, we created a web page on purpose where law enforcement's at the bottom. And we try and show on that web page all of the pathways to home, pathways healing, pathways to work. So people can visually see whether you know of somebody homeless, you want to help the homeless, you're tired of the homeless. We have business resources for trespassing letters. We have everything on there, and the law enforcement's at the bottom. And what that has helped do is relieve some of the calls for service going directly into the police department and bring them over to our operation to kind of help more on the environmental side and private property side.
Another thing I want to point out with the trifecta of laws that you mentioned, Sean, earlier, even though our laws have been diluted and our enforcement has been weakened, so to speak, I always just told the cops out in the street, it's still effective. Even though the enforcement has been out, it's still very effective. You provide all the outreach contacts, document that, and when they refuse those outreach and those resources, and you result to enforcement, even though you're writing them a citation, they may not get a lot of jail time. They may do a half hour in jail while you book them, and they get booted out the door right away. You know, that citation is going to go to warrants, and they're still getting a citation. They still don't like it. And that constant contact of outreach and enforcement while they're standing on that street corner causing you calls for service, eventually that homeless person is going to make a decision and go, okay, I got 20 contacts now. I got about 5 tickets pending. They're all going to go to bench warrant. Eventually, you know what? I think I am going to take that shelter bed because I'm tired of this constant, contact by outreach workers and law enforcement. So we know that's how it works because it worked for us that way in Anaheim, and we showed positive results that way.
So there's 2 questions in the chat box, and before we close, if we close right after that, Sandra did send me the property tag and their website, so I'll get those out to everyone. Did they hear right that based on, because you mentioned and maybe it's for you, Sandra, the Martin versus Boise case, that homeless are allowed to block walkways in public places due to that lawsuit, and kind of part 2 is, how do law-abiding tax-paying business owners protect themselves from the problems that are created? I know when we had our legislative summit in March, we had various folks talking. We had the sheriff of Kern County, and he said, yeah, a lot of cities in Bakersfield were paying like $30,000 a month for businesses to clean up fecal matter in front of their business. I mean, there's those kind of things. Obviously, there's greater problems than that they may need protection for, but are there laws to protect the business owners as well? So if we want to address that, and then there was one other question in the chat box.
Okay, I'll take those 2 really quick. So in our particular settlement lawsuit, blocking the sidewalks was specifically brought up because that was a huge problem for us. And what Federal Judge Carter has basically guided everybody is they were bringing up ADA a lot in the plaintiff's side. And so we used that against them and said, okay, well, when you're talking about blocking our sidewalks, ADA requires there should be clearance for anybody in a wheelchair. And so the judge then basically guided us and said that a homeless person cannot block the sidewalk and not leave at least 36 inches for people to walk by. So sometimes they get a little savvy in certain areas. I know in the city of Placentia, before they opened up their shelter, they had an encampment, and they actually, the homeless people put tape down after 36 inches and was commandeering the other side of the sidewalk. We used it to our nth degree. So if they were even had a foot over and were blocking 36 inches, our hot team had to get little keychain measuring tapes to go out and go, yep, you're blocking, and you've been offered services. And so it was just another tool in our toolbox to issue a ticket, take them to our jail for an hour or so, take their property, throw away 80% of it, and just keep making it uncomfortable for them to try and get their property back and go back to where they were. So that constant circulation is what they don't like. The other question on businesses, so Mike touched on it with the SEPTED. So we actually have SEPTED reports where we'll go out there and talk to them about their trash enclosures, which tend to be an attractant, lighting, shrubbery, and then we get a 602 letter, and we have our police department cadets keep those on file regularly. So we have them for a year, and we check in every year to make sure they want to re-up it. And that helps us get people at night that are trespassing and issue warnings. Because again, that constant contact with them, they don't like, they get uncomfortable. So we really work with our businesses. We have a fortunate of having our own utility company, and we give out free dusk to dawn lights. So there's a lot of resources we help with our business community, but partnering with your Chamber of Commerce is a huge asset.
And speaking of partnering, that kind of leads to the second question in the chat box was, how do you, and this maybe is for you or anybody that maybe is dealing with this, feel free to pipe in. How do you deal with service providers who believe it's not their responsibility to conduct outreach in the field, and they're saying, hey, you're the police, you do it?
Right. So we have a monthly homeless collaborative meeting that I run, and it's 200 plus service providers. And the reason we started that is, if you guys have had the same problem where we had 12 different nonprofits feeding in the same park on the same day, and our parks people were like, hey, they're throwing all this brand new food away. And so we ended up channeling and partnering with our chaplain, our police and fire chaplain, who runs a nonprofit, and he would be the one, and he's a pastor, and our outreach contractor, CityNet, that we utilize, they go out and talk to them. And it's a funny conversation, especially the faith-based, because they're saying, hey, God told us to be out here. And so our CityNet director is also a pastor, and so is our chaplain. They say, well, it's, we're in a conflict because God told me to come out and talk to you. So they have that conversation about better resources. And so we have a work program and other programs that we utilize with our homeless population. And so sometimes just guiding them, like, we don't want you to drop 10 pizzas in our park, but instead, if you want to make some sack lunches, we have a project where they're going to be painting out fire hydrants next week. And so it'd be great if you can meet us at this location and just provide this homeless population that's doing work and getting back on their feet to help motivate them. And so it's kind of guiding those nonprofits where they want to help. It's just sometimes they think they're helping and they're not. It's creating more of a havoc. And so guiding them through that. So we have a food calendar, we have different workforce. And so that monthly meeting really helps kind of guide us. And when we opened our shelters, we said we needed blankets. I had like 100 blankets in 24 hours. So you can actually use them to your advantage of what you need them for.
Very good. If there are any final comments or questions, feel free to unmute yourselves. I know we're coming up on 45 minutes, but as I mentioned, we wanted to leave time for questions and or any other final thoughts before we sign off. But before we do, I'll just mention real quick that once this once this recording is uploaded on YouTube, what I'll do is I'll send it to the list of everyone that registered today with all the resources that our facilitators provided. So that way you can share with other folks in your agency who want to watch the webinar as well. Any final comments or thoughts before we adjourn?
I just want to mention that Sandra and I, we travel up and down the state, and we teach this 8-hour HLO course. We obviously had some classes lined up with CPOA, but unfortunately the COVID kind of put a damper in that. But as soon as we get through this COVID situation, I'm sure we'll be back up and running. So if you need this type of training, it's also post-certified, then Sandra and I are more than willing to travel to your local jurisdiction and teach. Thank you.
And we are doing a Lexapol presentation on June 3rd. That one's going to be an hour, so it'll be a little bit longer and in depth. And again, we just gave a snippet We're not here to tell you we're the experts and what to do, but the more that we can all operate consistently, I think no matter where our homeless population are, because they are transitory, they're going to get hit with the same, hey, these are the rules here. Here's some resources. If you don't want them, you still have to abide by them. And that's going to help, I think, up and down the state of California, the more consistent we get. And like Mike said, we're happy to travel and do this on a bigger scale. We talk about creative co-enforcement, oversized vehicle ordinance, shopping cart ordinances that we have, all that stuff to deal with blight and property. Be happy to share it with everybody.
And we thank you for that, for partnering with us to bring those courses for those, as was mentioned, was kind of sidelined, but obviously we will find a way to get those to everyone. And we appreciate both of your participation today, as well as everyone who attended. So look for the follow-up to be emailed for everyone. But continue to stay safe and healthy out there, and we hope you join us next time. Thanks a lot.